So before I begin the review, I just wanted to say that I truly think Inscryption is a game that you should experience as blind as possible. I keep the first half of the review where I explain the basic game mechanics, mostly spoiler free, other than giving some context to the situation you find yourself in. But if you're interested in deck building roguelike games, or perhaps indie titles that can be a bit bizarre in their ideas and execution, then I'd consider playing the game first and then coming back to this review. And now, without further ado, let's dive into this. From the very first moments I started Inscryption, I was instantly captivated. Oddly enough though, it wasn't necessarily because of the great card game mechanics, but rather it was the dark tone and the sense of foreboding evil and mystery that really pulled me into the game. The second I embarked on my journey, I found myself completely taken by the game and engrossed in the world that it built. Hey guys, James here again with another game review, this time talking about Inscryption, an indie deck-building roguelike game developed by Daniel Mullins Games and published by Devolver Digital. To be honest though, that description doesn't quite do Inscryption justice. That's because Inscryption pulls you in all sorts of directions, constantly throwing curveballs at you and making you wonder what is going to happen next. In Inscryption, you find yourself in a dingy cabin with a mysterious captor. They force you to play through a tabletop game of sorts where your character is lost and wanders through different biomes, like a snowy forest or a festering swamp. Along the way, you recruit different animal pals who come to your aid and fight for you. You add critters to your deck, make them stronger, and hopefully, find a way out.
It's time to do.
So first, let's jump into the card game mechanics. Unlike a lot of video card games which seem to use slower ramping mana systems, Inscryption takes a chapter out of Yu-Gi-Oh's book and uses sacrifice as its main mechanic. This is true both in the core combat encounters of the game, as well as different points of interest you come across along your journey. Throughout every combat encounter, you have two decks. Your main deck is where you keep all the different beasts that have joined you so far. You then have a side deck which is completely composed of squirrels, which act as your base sacrifice, or a resource card essentially. On any given turn, you're only able to draw from one of the two decks, and I do think that this bit of decision making alone adds some depth to the thinking and strategy in the game. Do you play it safe and take a squirrel, or do you take the risk of drawing a card you might not be able to play? Most cards have a blood cost represented by the blood drops at the top. In order to play a certain animal, you have to sacrifice that number of other animals regardless of the blood cost of the animals that you're sacrificing. Additionally, later on in the game you learn about bones. Essentially, whenever one of your animals dies, you receive a bone from it. These accumulated bones can then be used to summon certain beasts, and I found that having this alternate resource helped to give the deck building some more variety. Each animal has an attack and a health stat, and a fairly large number of cards have other abilities represented by the sigils drawn on the card. There's quite a large variety of card abilities, so much so that they have this little guidebook you can reference in order to learn all the different abilities. Just to name a couple, there are some cards which fly and attack your opponent directly, some which are worth more than just one sacrifice, some that can't permanently die, and the list goes on. During your turn, you can play as many cards as you want as long as you can afford the sacrifices needed. The Game Master will also preview what cards they will place the next turn. This makes it so that you can strategically think about the best way for you to play your cards to both deal and avoid damage. Then, when you're satisfied with your plays, you hit the bell in order to end your turn. Your animals will then automatically attack the space directly in front of them. If your animal attacks another animal, it will deal its attack to the opposing card's health, without taking any damage back. If you deal any extra damage to the enemy card's health, the extra damage can actually overflow to those behind them that the Game Master might have placed out as a preview. If your beast attacks the enemy directly, it will deal its attack to your enemy. However, unlike other games where your enemy has life points which you need to deplete, here, your damage will add fake teeth to a scale. In order to win an encounter, you have to outweigh the opponent by 5 teeth. I really like the whole scale mechanic, and I think it's such a unique way to handle combat. The weight system, as well as the use of sacrifices, makes it so that momentum can sometimes swing in an instant, and it definitely does change the calculus of the game. While board control and getting rid of enemy beasts is of course important, oftentimes the right move is to attack the enemy directly and get damage in order to balance out the scale. Not only that, but while I think looking for and calculating lethal is important in any card game, I feel like miscalculations here just seem all the more punishing. This could maybe be due to the smaller health pool and the fact that you can fairly easily one-turn kill. I think the weight mechanic also makes the battles that much more tense as the scale tips back and forth between both sides. And honestly, that's the core of the combat in a nutshell. There are some special cards and items in the game which you can use throughout the journey, but I think these are worth experiencing yourself, so I won't really be discussing them.
Oh no! I'm lost!
So like I mentioned before, in Inscryption, you're forced by your captor to play through a tabletop game of sorts. Like many other deck builders, you trek through the map with different points of interest. Something to note is that the paths here do feel a bit more restrictive than in other games, which isn't necessarily a problem, but just something I noticed. Of course, you have your enemy encounter spots, and there are also some points which will throw some pretty unique enemy encounters at you. This includes totem fights, which will grant enemy units additional abilities, making them more difficult than standard fights. Then of course you have your standard add a card to your deck areas, remove a card from your deck areas, as well as areas you can grab additional items to help you in any engagements. Outside of those though, there are some pretty unique points of interest. I want to highlight two here in particular. One which I really liked are the bonfires. As you make your way through the maps, you might find yourself arriving at a campfire with a group of hungry survivors. You choose one animal to place near the fire in order to increase its stats. Then, if you want, you can elect to leave your animal by the fire even longer to give it additional boosts. But be careful, every time you do this, you run the risk of the hungry survivors grabbing and devouring your animal pal. The other point of interest I want to call out are the sigil altars. At these altars, you select one animal to sacrifice and another animal to do the sacrificing. The sacrificed animal's abilities are then transferred to the other animal. This can lead to some pretty crazy powerful beasts, and additionally, since it removes a card from your deck, visiting these can significantly improve your deck. Like other roguelikes, dying at any point will send you back to the beginning. However, I do think I need to disclose that Inscryption isn't your typical roguelike experience, at least not in the base game. I won't spoil why here, but I do think it's something important to let people know. Even though I enjoyed it, I can see that some people might be a bit confused or perhaps even disappointed with the direction that the game goes in. To an extent, I would maybe even agree that the game might have been better off as a traditional roguelike. Thankfully, the developers are in the process of designing and testing a separate mode called Casey's Mod, which turns the game into your more traditional experience, and after trying it, I think it's cool, but definitely could use some more work. Alright, next let's talk about the technical stuff. I personally actually really like the graphics. They try to emulate this sort of old school DOS style, which is reminiscent of old computer games. It can seem a bit crude at times, but I did find it fit really well with everything they were trying to do. I also like the card designs, and I think the art for the cards is well done, although definitely a bit more on the simplistic side. With regards to the audio, I don't really think I have complaints here. I think the sound effects are all really well done, and in particular, I really like the sound your captor makes when they speak. It can be oddly chilling and fits really well with the character and themes. I also thought that the music was really well done, especially for the different boss battles. I don't know if any of it will be stuff that you listen to on Spotify, but again, I think the music does a great job of setting the right tone and atmosphere. Alright, so before I get to the spoiler section of the review, I want to give my overall conclusion. What did I think of Inscryption? Well, honestly, I loved it, and if you watch my top games of 2021 video, you'd know I placed it pretty high on the list. I just think there's so much to enjoy here. The game definitely gets weird, but even so, the first act of the game is probably one of my favorite gaming moments of the year. Personally, I think Inscryption is 100% worth the $20 price tag, and hopefully with Casey's mod, the game will become even more worth it. I think it's a fair price also when compared to other deck building games. I'm giving Inscryption a 4 out of 4. While I think it might not be a game for everyone, and I'd maybe argue that the game might be a bit too long, I think those who give themselves into it will be in for a wild ride that I'm not sure you'll experience anywhere else. Alright, again, real quick, I'm going to get into spoilers now, so if you want to experience Inscryption for yourself, go play it, and definitely come back after you're done. From here on out, I'm going to assume that you've completed Inscryption or don't care about the spoilers. I think maybe the easiest way to discuss the game would have to be just going through every act and giving my thoughts on them. Like I already mentioned, Act 1 with Leshy is one of my favorite gaming moments of the year. You find yourself with a mysterious captor whose face you can't even see. The dude is acting like a dungeon master taking you through a journey. I just really enjoyed that theme and the Saw-like idea of your captor abducting you to play in their twisted little game. Right off the bat, the game also just oozed this sense of malevolence, and I think that really kept me intrigued. Even though I wouldn't say that Inscryption is a true horror game, it definitely had moments that kept me on edge and sent chills down my spine. This was especially true the first time I died, and I couldn't help but want to start another run immediately. I also really like the death cards. While some you create might be wildly overpowered, I think the main thing I enjoyed about the death cards was the fact that you could customize them and name them. Then, in future runs, you might run into the past lives, and I think this only helped to strengthen that feeling of horror the game gives you, like, your friend's soul is captured in this card. I think the boss fights are probably some of the best parts of the game. In particular, I really like the trapper fight thematically, although in my opinion, this fight can sometimes feel like the easiest one, maybe due to the stage of the game that you meet them. I think the Leshy fight was pretty cool as well, and you even get to destroy the moon, which may be a bit cliche, but still cool. Obviously though, I do find myself wishing that there were more bosses. The 4 bosses are cool, but when you go into a game thinking it's a roguelike, you almost assume that each map will have a few different bosses. I'm hoping as Casey's mod is developed, additional bosses are added to the game, as this would really help with replayability. I think another thing which might get some mixed reactions would be the difficulty of the game. Inscryption is not easy by any means, but I do think given some of the death cards as well as areas of interest where you can buff your cards, beating the first act often comes down to your luck. Get the right cards and suddenly the game just feels way too easy. Of course, this could be said for any deck builder, but I think maybe due to the smaller amount of damage needed for lethal, and the fact that the game has to let you win to move on, it can feel particularly true here. Also real quick, I want to discuss some of the different puzzles littered throughout every act of the game. I had some mixed feelings around these. Some just felt insanely cryptic or like I had to stumble upon it or look it up, while others they made very direct to you. One puzzle type particularly present is what I'll call the battle puzzles. Essentially, these puzzles imitate a battle encounter and your job is to move the pieces in order to deal lethal. I thought these were fun little ways of testing your game knowledge, but I did find that some of the later ones were a bit difficult to understand for reasons I'll get into later. So then when you finally beat what you think is the full game, you're thrown into a video camera memory card. So yeah, turns out Inscryption, in addition to being a deck builder, is also an ARG game with a fleshed out story. Here you learn about the journey of Luke Carter, a card game YouTuber who stumbles upon a mysterious copy of the game Inscryption. I think it's implied that you're either watching Luke play the game, or you are Luke playing the game. I'm not really quite sure how to feel about the ARG elements, as this is one of my first experiences with a game like this. I think it's pretty cool honestly, but not necessarily something I personally get that into. I think these sections definitely help to add to the intrigue and mystery of the game, and overall, I think the acting's actually not bad. As a part of the whole ARG, I think there's also a ton of random clues and puzzles scattered throughout the game, which I believe people on the internet have worked or are working through to solve. So if that seems like something up your alley, you might be pleasantly surprised by the game. Act 2 was a pretty bizarre change of pace, but definitely an intriguing one. You're taken to this 2D pixel art universe, and I think Luke's reaction says it perfectly.
What is this?
I thought the graphics were fine, but personally, I didn't really like the UI in this section. Here you go through different worlds and fight against 4 different major bosses called the Scribes, each with their own deck archetype. The game introduces these different card types to you, and personally, I have some very mixed and maybe even negative feelings towards some of these alternate deck archetypes and mechanics. I think this is largely because I don't feel like these alternate deck types are nearly as well thought out or as engaging as the beast mechanics, which I'll explain a bit more once we hit Act 3. Since I personally had stuck with a beast deck, I found the gameplay here fun still, but I wonder how people who might have selected different deck types might feel. Was I just not giving the other deck archetypes a chance? In Act 3, you find yourself in Bottopia, and again, here they've abandoned the roguelike style of the game in Act 1. Instead, now if you die, you lose all your money and you're taken back to the start of the area, but you keep your cards and you can make your way back to your money to reclaim it. You also return to the 3D art style, and I thought it was cool that we got to experience another Scribe's world. Personally, I had some pretty mixed feelings about Act 3 as well, again, mainly because I felt like the card mechanics were not nearly as interesting without the sacrifice mechanic. The robot archetype is more reminiscent of more classic card games, using energy to slowly build up to play cards. I think maybe I disliked this because 1, there just wasn't as cool of a variety of robots when compared to the other animals, and 2, due to the nature of playing empty vessels, which are the robot equivalent of squirrels, you often end up with spaces on the board which feel pretty useless and you don't have any option to remove them or sacrifice them. This can often lead to situations where you have like one dude who can actually attack, and it becomes a slow war of attrition. Maybe part of it is just me needing to be better, but I do think the game felt way slower paced, and as a result, the third act kind of felt like a bit of a slog to get through. Not only that, but I found the Bottopia map a little bit difficult to navigate, and found myself having to backtrack everywhere. To be honest, at this point, I did start to feel like the game was overstaying its welcome. Despite me disliking the card game mechanics, I did find that Act 3 gives you some pretty interesting challenges. For example, there are stages where instead of fighting enemies, you need to deal a certain amount of damage before a bomb goes off. I also enjoyed the bosses here, such as the boss that you have to program yourself based on different rules. Then finally, after you beat P03, the Inscryption game begins to implode, and you're taken through this crazy final section. Here you play against the other Scribes you faced in Act 2, but this time you get small glimpses into their 3D worlds. Again, some mixed feelings here. On the one hand, given the situation with the game erasing itself, I did feel a tinge of sadness that my journey was ending and I wouldn't be able to fully experience the last 2 Scribes worlds. However, again, I just couldn't help but feel like the actual card game mechanics for these guys was not nearly as fun or as well thought out as in Act 1. It's hard to really blame the devs too. Imagine trying to design and balance one card game, let alone 4 which might have different interactions with each other. I think the zombie lady is fine overall. I think her world is a pretty interesting concept as you make your way across an almost chessboard-like map. The card mechanics here are based around the bone system and using gravediggers to generate more bones. I think I definitely would have liked to have explored her world more out of all the other Scribes. Then you have the mage, which in my opinion seems like the worst archetype in the game. By this point, the game is almost deleted, so you only do battle without getting to see his actual world. However, the game does take on a very different look, which I kind of enjoyed, as it's kind of reminiscent of Yu-Gi-Oh! Similar to the robots, in order to play magic cards, you need to use these different colored stones called mocks. I think here it faces the same problem as the robot decks, where you just end up with dead spaces because you have to play down your Mox cards before summoning other creatures. However, since there's multiple Mox types and no convenient way to remove them from the board, this can often clog up the board and really slow down the game in a negative way, especially if you draw the wrong Mox for your hand. There are some interesting mechanics though, such as exploding Mox, but I found it very difficult to understand how exactly this worked. They even have a puzzle for it at some point which tests you on your knowledge of this, and I still have no idea how I solved it. All that being said, maybe I'd feel a little bit differently about them if I'd played those deck types more in Act 2. But again, let me know your experience with them and maybe if I'm underrating these deck types. And that's about it. The game deletes itself, Luke meets his fate, and the game Inscryption somehow finds its way to the internet, corrupting computers everywhere. Honestly, the whole story felt a bit nonsensical to me in the moment. I found it hard to understand what was happening in the game world, and it wasn't really until I took a step back and looked it up on Wikipedia that I got an understanding of everything that was happening. That doesn't necessarily mean the story was bad. In fact, I think the overall idea is great, but it's definitely a strange one. Now, after this whole spoiler-full discussion, you might be wondering, James, how are you still giving Inscryption a 4 even after criticizing half the game? And honestly, you're not wrong. It does feel a bit odd to list off all of these issues I had, but still think that the game is worthy of a full rating. I think though it ultimately comes down to how I like to look at games. To me, I see video games as an experience, and Inscryption is just an experience that I won't soon forget. But let me know what you think. Have you tried Inscryption? What'd you think of it? Of course, you made it this far, I truly appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and as usual, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.